Dead Space is one of the most tense and unforgettable horror franchises ever made. What started as a small project inspired by Resident Evil 4 turned into a masterclass of horror, and EA almost killed it multiple times along the way. Today, I'll tell you the story of how Dead Space became a horror masterclass, almost died, and came back stronger than ever, so buckle up. The original Dead Space game was developed by a small team called EA Redwood Shores, but the game almost never existed. You see, they always wanted to make their own games, and even pitched a second sequel of System Shock to EA, but it was never greenlit. On top of that, at the time, EA was notoriously known for sticking to proven franchises and licensed games. So after seeing the success of Resident Evil 4 and deciding to make their own horror game, approval was unlikely. To add insult to injury, the team wanted it to be slower, more tense, almost silent, and generally scarier, which made the approval even less likely.
I'm Glen Schofield, creator and director of Dead Space. I set out to make the scariest game of all time. Along the way, I had to break some rules, make some new ones, and really redefine how I make video games.
They had only one chance and 6 months to develop a demo, and that's not an easy task. Think about it. When you have one shot to prove your horror game, you can't just show gameplay. You have to make the player feel it. They couldn't just Google scary music sound pack and consider it done. Everything had to be as perfect as possible, and the demo turned out to be exactly that. Perfection. So much so that, to the surprise of everyone, EA approved the project. The team started working on the game. However, they didn't want to just copy Resident Evil. No, they wanted to make the scariest game in existence. Horror by itself is a pretty niche genre, so I wouldn't be surprised if the team had doubts. Will players accept slower, scarier horror? Is innovation worth risking a financial disaster? But it didn't matter, because the team wanted to make it happen, and they proved to EA that the idea had legs. In October 2008, the game was released, and despite the doubts and slow start of sales, it was a success. Dead Space sold over 1 million copies in the first year and became critically acclaimed. And for a good reason. The fear felt real. The design of the ship puts you in isolating corridors and chambers. You spend almost the entire game by yourself without being physically close to other people. You don't have a classic interface like you do in most other games, so all you see is a little bit of information over the shoulder of the character. And my favorite part is the sound design. It would be an understatement to say that the sound design in this game is good. It's more than that. There's barely any music. What you do hear are distant screams of survivors, the roar of monsters, system failure sounds, and the sounds of the station falling apart. Those sounds become very clear precisely because of the use of silence. The section in space takes it to a whole other level because there can't be any sound in space. It's pure physics. During that section, you have to be extra careful with your moves, because monsters can come out of nowhere without any warning, and all you hear is muffled sounds, the vibrations that Isaac is feeling. This attention to detail is incredible, but when music does show up, it's brilliant. It's slow and methodical. It was achieved by automating the volume of the instruments to make it sound like it's breathing, dynamic, and even alive. That automation technique makes you feel all the dread and makes it feel like the ship itself is having a full-on mental breakdown, struggling to breathe. If you're a musician and want to make something similar, I suggest using libraries like Heaviosity, Albion 1, Orchestral Swarm, or Kepler Orchestra. They're a tad bit expensive, but totally worth it if you can afford it. Anyway, all of that made the game a masterclass in horror. However, the success of the game was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they proved to everyone that a slow, methodical horror game can be commercially viable, but on the other hand, that also meant that EA was now watching, and EA wanted broader appeal. All of that meant that the second game had to be made, and despite the increased internal pressure, the team, which was now rebranded to Visceral Games, walked on very thin ice. They added more cinematic action and generally polished the second game more, but kept the horror intact. The game once again was a commercial success. It's considered by many fans to be the peak of the series. It was everything the gamers loved, but with a bigger budget, which meant more polish. As Cheat says, success.
Success. Success!
But that wasn't gonna last. EA now had a franchise that they could milk, and they wanted it to have an even broader appeal, and that was going to prove almost deadly to the franchise. Dead Space 3 was the Resident Evil 6 of Visceral Games. Just like Resident Evil 6, which tried to be too many things at once, a shooter, a horror, a bloody Hollywood movie, honestly, that whole game felt like a fever dream. But that's a topic we'll discuss in the next episode, so consider subscribing and joining the Discord server not to miss it. Anyway, Dead Space 3 tried to broaden the appeal and earn as much money as possible that it actually forgot that it was a horror game. Resident Evil 6 came out in 2012, a year before the release of Dead Space 3, and it should have set off the alarms in the office that going full-on shooty-shooty was a bad idea, but it didn't. Dead Space 3, despite doing commercially okay, had a lot of problems. It had microtransactions, the gameplay shifted more toward being a shooter, and for some reason they even added co-op to the game, even though some fans liked it. Moreover, the soundtrack and sound design also changed. Instead of scaring the player and using silence to send chills down your spine, it was way more mainstream. It practically tells the player, hey, it's a cool moment. It wasn't something fans grew to love in the first two games, which was evident from the reviews. On top of that, the game failed to sell 5 million copies required by EA for the franchise to continue, which is funny because the first two games never hit that milestone either. But I mean, on paper, the decisions behind Dead Space 3 were solid from the business standpoint. Microtransactions can increase profits, and adding more action can increase sales and broaden the appeal. But EA forgot something very important: video games or art. You can't just pixelate a Picasso painting, charge people per pixel, and expect them to be happy when at the end of the day, it's not even a Picasso painting at all. So naturally, fans were disappointed, things were bad, and after a while, the original team was shut down. EA practically shot themselves in the foot and killed the franchise. Years went by, a lot of fans moved on to other horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill to scratch the itch. Until July 2021, when EA and Motive Studios announced that they were making a remake of the original first game. Fans were happy, but also skeptical. I mean, it makes sense. Remakes were popular at the time, and some feared that EA, being EA, just wanted to make some cash on nostalgia and a famous IP. But when the trailer dropped in October 2022, the game seemed to be genuinely good, and you could see the excitement in the comments. People couldn't wait to play the game, and all we had to do was wait. And in January 2023, the game was released, and the game was amazing. Everything that fans loved about the first two games was brought back and cranked up to 11. Visuals, stunning. Horror, terrifying. Soundtrack and sound design, pure horror. Fans absolutely loved the remake, and it was critically acclaimed. The game once again proved to be a masterclass in horror. The original ideas from the first two games that the original team came up with stood the test of time. Given the modern technologies and the polishing of the original ideas, Motive Studios managed not only to bring the entire franchise back, but also make a genuinely good game, and thus, the franchise came back to life, at least for a while. It's unclear if we'll get another remake or a whole other entry in the series because, allegedly, this remake didn't hit the necessary sale requirements set by EA, though I'm not entirely sure how true that is. This goes to show that making a truly scary and successful horror game is a challenge and a half. You need to balance the creative vision with publishers' demands, while keeping the game itself mainstream enough to justify the initial investments. At the end of the day, there aren't many horror games that can genuinely scare the player, but Dead Space is one of those rare games. Anyway, my name is Mike Hall, subscribe to the channel not to miss future episodes like this one, and as always, stay awesome and keep making this world a better place.